Today we get to have another chat about the Crypts of Winterfell and something that may be hidden down there. Because we all know there is something hidden down there, and it's going to be an important part of the endgame of our story, and there are many theories about what that could possibly be. Now, if you're familiar with the channel and you've seen a lot of my past videos, you'll know I've already done a video about something that could potentially be down in the Crypts of Winterfell, and essentially it is the core of the giant heart tree system of power that is seemingly controlling all of Westeros. This is taking a little bit of the show clue that you have someone strapped up to a weirwood tree and then stabbed through the heart with what looks to be either an obsidian knife or a glass candle potentially, in order to create the others. Now that theory relied a bit on some information about glass candles that comes from an unused draft of A Feast for Crows that sort of gives us a window into George's mind and what he was thinking, but it is ultimately something that he chose to remove from the book, so we don't know if it's a reveal he's saving for later or something that he's decided to actually change about how glass candles work. But what we were told about glass candles was that you could essentially bind yourself to eternal life by somehow binding yourself to a glass candle. And as long as that flame burns, whoever is bound to the candle cannot die. This led me to wonder that, well, if maybe you have some of these bodies that are strapped up to the weirwoods and bound to glass candles, if you were going to hide those glass candles somewhere, not wanting those bodies to ever die, well, hiding them deep down in the Crypts of Winterfell, guarded by the Kings of Winter, and potentially even warded by magical spells within the walls of Winterfell itself, that's a very secure place to store something that is essentially the heart and core of your magical giant system of protection. It's a little more complicated than that, and you can go check out the full video if you want to after this to get the full details on that theory. And this theory is in a similar vein, right? But we're not talking too much about glass candles today because that's some speculative stuff from a draft that ended up not actually fully getting used, so maybe if you don't want to go down that route, there is something else that would sort of fit the same theme and the same ideas that could also be down in the Crypts of Winterfell. And not only that, but this option is something that realistically should be down in the Crypts of Winterfell one way or the other, and that is the body of Bran the Builder, assuming he was a real person. And I assume he probably was on some level or another, even if his legend has been sort of conflated and multiple people have been given credit for his actions. There had to at least be a founder of House Stark, even if it wasn't the one who did all of the things that are necessarily credited to Bran the Builder. So as it relates to this theory, the essential idea is that the founder of House Stark would essentially be buried deep down in the Crypts of Winter. In fact, the deepest down in the Crypts of Winter, because somehow Winterfell has the oldest kings buried at the deepest levels, and the newer kings are up on the higher levels, even though that doesn't quite make sense without some sort of magic or some sort of, weird system of building or planning that we haven't gotten the full details on, because generally how it would work is you would bury your kings and then you could dig newer levels deeper, but you couldn't really build newer levels up higher on the crypts, you know what I'm saying? If you were digging a second basement deeper below your current basement, that'd be a lot easier than trying to put a floor in between your main floor and your basement. But at the same time, if there's some sort of magic that's being used to do this, that could also work. But the mystery of how exactly that happens isn't the important part of this video, so we're just going to leave that as it is for now. Maybe if you have an idea down in the comments, you could let me know. The important thing is the deepest thing down in the Crypts of Winterfell should probably be the founder of House Stark. The other important thing about Bran the Builder is his very strong connections to the idea of weirwood magic on some level or another. So when you take into account the legend that he built Winterfell, and you take into account the fact that there are obviously going to be weirwood roots that are reaching deep down below Winterfell because the heart tree in the Godswood there is older than the castle itself, it would make a lot of sense that the deepest levels of the crypts might be infested with weirwood roots just reaching in and through them like we see with a lot of the caves. Another thing that's come up quite a bit in the videos that I've put out on the channel so far is the fact that when Bran is down deep in Bloodraven's cave, he sees deep in the weirwood roots a bunch of bodies of past Greenseers who are still alive. And they are implied to be very old because they are the past Greenseers and there are many of them. So while we don't know exactly how old they are, it is reasonable to think that, these bodies are going to be sustained forever by this weirwood magic by being tangled up in the roots. The other thing that I've speculated about in the past is a quote from George R.R. Martin when he was asked, "Is there the Night King in the books?" he points out that, well, the Night's King in the books is a historical figure from the Age of Heroes who is no more likely to be alive today than, say, Bran the Builder or Lan the Clever. Using that line, and then using the fact that Bran the Builder is so linked to this weirwood magic, and the weirwood magic can sustain these bodies forever, it seems like, it actually seems like it might not be so unlikely that the Night's King and Bran the Builder himself are alive in a similar fashion to these ancient green seers that we see tangled in the weirwood roots. Now, I've done several videos talking about the implications of that in terms of what's happening with the Night's King and the Night Fort and things like that, so today we get to talk about the idea that Bran the Builder himself is in fact also still alive, just like we see these bodies down in the weirwoods, which would make a lot of sense considering, he was sort of the originator of this whole system, and if anyone was going to keep themselves strapped to eternal life, and in some sort of position of power maintained by this weirwood magic, well, the guy who founded the entire system is probably a pretty good candidate for who would be sitting in that seat of power. So yes, the first part of this theory is that Bran the Builder has essentially been able to create a magical system that has allowed him to sustain his own life and put himself in some sort of position of power deep down in the weirwood roots where maybe he can use his green seeing ability or warging ability to be, possibly sending visions, possibly controlling animals. Who really knows? There's many different ways that this could go. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to point out in this video, and you can probably tell this by the title now where I'm going with this is a lot like Mr. House from Fallout New Vegas. Some spoilers for one of the best video games I've ever played, Fallout New Vegas. Basically what's going on there is that New Vegas is essentially saved by the technological actions of someone known as Mr. House. And you see him as this giant projected face on a computer screen and no one really knows too much about him. He's got this well-guarded casino that is essentially his home that no one is allowed in or out of. Not unlike the deepest levels of the Crypts of Winterfell where no one has been down there in centuries. Now the other thing that's going on is there are these robots all around the world called Securitrons, which seem to be like remarkably intelligent robots, even though they're supposed to be just like these automated, essentially robo-cops that roll around and just enforce the law. The thing that you realize eventually about these Securitrons is that they are all essentially controlled by Mr. House through his technological means and this giant technological system that he has built. Whereas Bran the Builder is doing a magical system using weirwood magic and green sight, Mr. House is using robotics and technology for essentially the same purpose. So rather than warging into these animals or casting any sort of shadow using shadow magic, Mr. House is just using his computer program to control all these robots, and they are out there essentially enforcing his will and maintaining his utopia, running society in the way that he wants it run. Now, when you go deeper into his casino and actually try to break through his layers of security, if you're able to, what you find is, in fact, Mr. House isn't the charismatic guy on the TV screen that you see. He is essentially an old man who is strapped into this system that maintains his body and essentially feeds fluids into him to give him eternal life, so that he can constantly run this system and keep enforcing his will and essentially keep, the world running in the way that he sees fit. Also, for real, if you haven't played Fallout New Vegas, go play Fallout New Vegas. It's really, really good. Now, if it is in fact true that Bran the Builder has set himself up in a similar situation to Mr. House, that means he's kind of been overseeing the world of Westeros through the weirwoods for, thousands and thousands of years. But one thing that I kind of find really interesting that I've been thinking about recently is the fact that he might have an army of Securitrons, much like Mr. House does. Now, this is sort of a thing that we talked about last time when we talked about if the Crypts of Winterfell did hold the sort of core of this magical power system that keeps the Starks in power the entire time, well then the statues in the Crypts of Winterfell might actually be on some level there to guard this system of power. Essentially, these stone statues of all the old Kings of Winter could, on some level or another, be Bran the Builder's Securitrons. Rather than an army of metal robots with guns who can go out there and guard Mr. House, you have an army of stone soldiers with their swords that could go out there and guard Bran the Builder if someone ever got past the first layers of defenses to try and get in there to mess with him. Now, this is an idea that I sorta had in the back of my mind, and it feels like it's getting even more and more plausible as I go back and rewatch Eldrick Stoneskin's entire series that he did on the Kings of Winter deep down in the Crypts of Winterfell, which you should definitely check out if you haven't seen it so far. And stay tuned on my channel because at some point or another, me and Eldrick are probably going to try and hop on a live stream and have a good chat about the Crypts of Winterfell and try to get to the bottom of different things that we've each talked about in our theories. If my organizational skills were better or I had my life together more, I would tell you a date for that, but I don't have a date for that yet. Just hit that subscribe button and at some point or another it'll happen and you won't miss it. I can't tell you when it'll be, but I can assure you it will be interesting. And one of the things that Eldrick Stoneskin points out in the early episodes of his series is how often these statues down in the Crypts of Winter are described as if they are alive. What's really striking to me about the way these statues are described, now that I've been doing my series on what I think is going on for the last few months, it's how much they are similar to the way that the bodies are described down deep in the roots of Bloodraven's cave. When people are walking past the statues deep down in the crypts, it is often said that it feels like the eyes are following them, which is a bit weird for stone statues to have eyes that follow people, but when Bran is deep down in the cave walking as Hodor, he also mentions how the bodies that are stuck in the weirwood roots are having their eyes follow him, and one of them even opens its mouth to try to speak, which is basically complete confirmation that these bodies are definitely alive. With the statues and the bodies that their eyes just follow, you could write it off as just a trick of the light or something like that, but there's no way you can say that about someone who actually tries to open their mouth to talk. So if these bodies with their eyes following you down in the tree roots are definitely still alive, could the same be said for the statues deep down in the Crypts of Winterfell? I think that could certainly be a conclusion that you could draw. Another way that this could potentially work is that there is some sort of life force that actually goes into the stone of these statues that would allow them to be warged in a similar way to maybe an animal. So even if they aren't fully alive on their own, perhaps Bran the Builder can look through the eyes of these statues, and if he needed to, perhaps he could raise these statues and essentially warg them in the way that Bran can warg a flock of ravens. And also, of course, in the way that Mr. House can use his Securitrons, to tie it back to the entire topic of this video. Now, another thing that I find very interesting about the potential idea of the Stark life force upon death going into their stone statues is that if that's what's actually happening, that means they're not going into the weirwood trees when they die. If they're going into the stone when they die, it would seem likely that they are not also going into the trees. Which is a bit weird because the entire Old Ways culture seems to be about going into the trees upon death. Now, this does bring me to another line that is said when Bran arrives at Bloodraven's cave and he's talking to Leaf about the children of the forest. When he asks, "Where are all the rest of you?" she is said, "Gone down into the earth, into the stones and into the trees," which sort of implies that those are two different places that you could go upon death, and maybe they're both part of the old god's religion on some level or another. There is also this line from Bran 7, A Game of Thrones, which I'll have the full context up on the screen for you. But speaking about the children of the forest, this is what's said. "Their gods were the gods of the forest, stream, and stone, the old gods whose names are secret." Now, something that I've been thinking a lot about lately that I'm really interested to hear all of your takes on down in the comments is the idea that what if the forest and the stream and the stone are on some level or another different old gods, right? They've built all of the old gods culture that we know around the worship of these trees, and everyone says you go into the trees when you die. But if the Starks themselves, who are constantly compared to stone, which Eldrick Stoneskin points out so well, and all of these little connections are made by George constantly comparing the Starks to stone in different ways, and the Starks seem to go into the stone statues when they die rather than going into the trees, and in addition to that, you could also describe the way that the Tullys are buried as going into the stream, right? So you have different old gods that are different things that apparently you could go into upon death, the stone, the stream, and the trees, and it seems like the powerful houses are choosing to go into the stream and into the stone. And when you combine that with something we've talked about in the past, how it seems very possible that these weirwood trees have undergone some sort of corruption and have changed from what their original magic was, well, that's just really, really interesting to me, because, pro tip, if the people who are in charge of you and telling you how to live your life and basically ruling over you are all telling you that, hey, you need to go into the trees when you die, and they're sacrificing people to these trees constantly, and these trees are creepy and bloody and all of that, and then they themselves don't go into the trees when they die, they try to do something else when they die, you should be a little suspicious of that, right? Like in real life, if you had your entire religious order telling you, hey, when you die, you really need to be buried. Buried in a proper funeral, it's very, very important. And then when all of the priests or the people running that very same religious order die, all of them are cremated. You should look at that and go, wait a minute, why are you telling us to do one thing upon our death, but then upon your death you're doing a completely different thing? That's a little suspicious, isn't it? So if going into the stones and into the trees is one and the same thing, and it's all just going back to the old gods, well then there's no harm, no foul. But if these are two different things, the fact that the Starks themselves seem to not go into the trees when they die, they seem to go into the stone, that's very suspicious. And when you take that into account with the fact that these weirwoods on some level or another seem to definitely be corrupted from their original form, and not doing the original magic that they were probably doing back when they were the old gods of the Children of the Forest, and in fact they are even possibly all feeding blood into these bodies in order to sustain them, and feeding life force into these bodies in order to sustain them with magic, I could sort of see a system where essentially going into the weirwood trees is all basically a scam in order to sustain the bodies and sustain the life force of people like Bran the Builder, who are strapped into positions of power based around being strapped up to these ancient weirwood trees. Basically, I could see sort of a magical setup where all of the small folk who are told all the time, hey, you gotta go into the trees upon your death, maybe that used to be a real thing, and maybe that was what the Children of the Forest used to be all about, and, maybe that used to be a good thing, but ever since the corruption of the weirwoods, now if you go into the trees upon death, you are essentially having your life force turned into magical energy to sustain the system of power. Whereas if you want a true death, or you want to go to like the actual old gods, whatever that means, right, upon death, you would have to go into the stone in the way that the Starks seem to be doing. Essentially, going into the trees is basically a big trick for all of these first night babies, all of these small folk, all of these people who are sacrificed, all to ensure that basically the magic is maintained and the bodies strapped up to the trees are maintained. Meanwhile, the people who are actually in the know, the Kings of Winter, even if they've forgotten it by this point, have a completely different ritual upon their own death. It strikes me as weird, Maybe going into the stones and into the trees, as I said, is the same thing, but I'm really curious to hear what you guys think of that. Is it potentially a very important distinction that, all of these other people are going into the weirwoods when they die, but the Kings of Winter, who should, on some level or another, know what's actually going on, seem to be going into the stone? I suppose it really does on some level depend on how manipulative you think the Starks have been over the course of their history. But one thing that we should remember is that the Starks were pretty brutal and ruled over people in a pretty brutal fashion up until recent generations, which the fact that we're introduced to the Starks via Ned and his children makes the Starks seem much more nice and cuddly than they actually have been when you look at their history. So all in all, would it be that out of character for the Starks if their entire system of control is essentially one where they have manipulated the power of the old gods in such a way that it keeps them guaranteed to be remaining in power and able to subjugate all of these people for thousands and thousands of years? I don't know. You don't really generally tend to stay as a feudal ruler with the same family in power for thousands and thousands of years without some pretty brutal subjugation and a really good setup of a magical system that can maintain your power. The other thing that is definitely coming to mind as I talk about all of this is the fact that Bran the Builder, if he is still alive and stuck up to the trees in the way that he probably is most likely, in my opinion, well, then he is actually another very good candidate for who could be the Three-Eyed Crow. Now, we know that Bloodraven, when he's asked if he is the Three-Eyed Crow, seems very confused, and that has led many people to believe that maybe he's not actually the Three-Eyed Crow that appeared to Bran in his dreams and told him to fly or die. Many people also point out the very important fact that Bran means crow. So, a three-eyed Bran could be the Three-Eyed Crow. That would be a direct translation. This often leads to the speculation that the Three-Eyed Crow is a future, more enlightened version of Bran that is essentially guiding his past self, that is often referred to as time-traveling Bran. Now, we're definitely going to have to wait for future books to get the actual answer to this, but I do think both of those options, Bloodraven and time-traveling Bran, are potentially very good options for who could be the Three-Eyed Crow. But I also think that Bran the Builder, in this form that we've talked about him as the Westerosi Mr. House, the puppet master who can send out visions and potentially manipulate the world, he's also a very, very good option for who could be the Three-Eyed Crow. He is indeed a Three-Eyed Crow, a more magically advanced Bran who is out there able to potentially do all of the things that we see the Three-Eyed Crow doing. The important thing that you would need to realize, though, then about this is the idea that, well, the Three-Eyed Crow definitely seems to be setting Bran up, as I talked about in my video about Bloodraven recently, which you should definitely check out if you haven't seen it. It all seems like Bran, through his visions and through the way he's been manipulated up to that cave and getting wed to the trees, is being set up in a situation where he can potentially destroy this entire system. He is also in a potential situation where he could then cause a rebirth of this entire system and potentially be the one in charge of the Weirwoods in a future new age for the world, if that is indeed what goes on in the end of the books and it ends up becoming a story of rebirth, sort of like the Norse mythology cycle of rebirth that uses ice and fire in a sort of similar way. One potential way to look at this could be that Bran the Builder, if he is indeed the Three-Eyed Crow, and he is indeed on some level or another manipulating Bran into this position, he could be tired of his body being stuck to eternal life, and he could be done with the system that he has set up, but on some level or another, upon the rebirth of this world tree, and in order to essentially save the world from the others and all of the consequences, shall we say, of the system that he's set up, he could have realized the error of his ways, and perhaps he can't fix it himself on some level or another, because if he essentially destroys this entire system, he will die, and maybe some way or another, Bran could, being a younger version of Bran the Builder in some level or another, being a very powerful magical Stark, could actually lead this cycle of rebirth and become the one in power for a new age, and perhaps run the world in a better way than Bran the Builder set up his system. There's always been a theory that Bran himself is all of the past Brans, and he is actually Bran the Builder on some level or another using reincarnation or something like that, and George definitely likes to do a cyclical history thing with his world building, so I could see a situation where maybe if it isn't a direct reincarnation, Bran is the new Bran the Builder for a new age of heroes and a new age of green magic that will be coming by the end of these books. All of the setup, putting him in place, could be being done by the old Bran the Builder, who has now realized the error of his ways, or as I said, has grown tired of being strapped to a tree forever. So let me know what you think of all that down in the comments. Does this make sense on some level or another? Have some of the things that I've brought up sparked any interesting thoughts in you? Is there anything that I'm missing that might be an interesting piece to add to this mystery? And do you think that on some level or another, when we get down deep into the Crypts of Winterfell, we're going to find the body of Bran the Builder, or whoever, created this entire Weirwood system, still strapped there and in some way or another, in control of this entire system and potentially needing to be defeated? Do you think that Bran the Builder is potentially the Westerosi version of Mr. House? Let me know what you think of all of that down in the comments, and I'll be back with something else very soon.